you're kind of hiding a part of yourself, right? And again, maybe it might be protected in some context, but if you do that over time, then you have the potential, to feel inauthentic, and that can hurt your overall well-being down the line.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Felicia Zerwas, who is a PhD candidate in the social personality psychology area at the University of California at Berkeley. Her work focuses on understanding the role that emotions play in the formation and maintenance of close relationships. And I'm super excited to talk about this today. It's a theme that comes up a lot in the work that I do as an Ayurvedic practitioner. And I'm so happy that we were connected through a friend of mine, Dr. Iris Mouse, who runs the emotion and emotion regulation lab there. And I understand you work with Iris at UC Berkeley. Is that correct?
Yes. I've been her student for 7 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
I met Iris through another mutual friend who's a professor there, Dr. Allison Harvey, who's the director.
Nice.
Yeah, the director of the Sleep and Mood Research Clinic. Yeah, so I know Allie very well, and I've gone camping with Iris before. So yeah, I've been picking her brain for a while about different people to talk that are doing interesting research.
Yeah.
At Berkeley, and she thought of you for me to speak with, and I'm so happy we're here today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to discuss these topics that I've been thinking about for a really long time. And I think they're just all around us, meaning, emotions and relationships. I feel like you can't really get away from them.
As much as we try.
Right?
But without them, we wouldn't have art, right? So we wouldn't have so much
Exactly.
without them.
Yeah.
Or love probably, or we probably wouldn't have anything good without emotions.
I know. I think to me, they're the core of a good life, emotions and relationships, which is why they're such a focus of my work.
Well, I'm excited to hear what you're going to help us learn about ourselves today. Obviously, you are a perfect human and have completely mastered your emotions because you study them, right?
Right. Yes. This is something that gets brought up every time I, tell people what I do. That's so far from the truth. I do feel like it makes me more tuned in, I guess, to my own emotions and other people's emotions, but that does not mean that I am a master at enacting the strategies that I know might actually be helpful, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I taught yoga for many years, and, I think everybody was like, oh, you must be so healthy and so perfect. And okay, maybe I was, but, it's like we put people in these little pedestals when they're an expert in a certain things. So you're currently a PhD candidate and you're almost done, right?
Yes, I graduate in less than a month now, which is really exciting.
Okay, so we're getting her before she's been unleashed to the world. You've heard her first here on the Wisdom of the Body podcast. So how did you find yourself interested in this work so much that you actually decided to focus your PhD in this area of emotion and emotion regulation?
Yeah, it was a long road, I guess, to get here. My mom is a very kind, genuine, giving, she's got that very caregiver personality. And so I feel like from a very young age, she emphasized relationships and, reciprocity in relationships and being vulnerable. And so that was just kind of a value, I guess, that I've had throughout my whole life. And I think it influenced the spaces that I occupied, in high school and in undergrad. In undergrad specifically, I was part of many volunteer opportunities where I got to see how different relationships functioned. For example, I worked in a pediatric oncology ward where, I mean, you can imagine there are just so many different relationships there, the parents with the child, the provider with the child, the provider with the parents. And it was really intriguing to watch those interactions and see kind of what made those things go well versus poorly. And to me, a lot of it came down to vulnerability and the emotions that were, expressed or not expressed. And that was the backside of it. And then on the research side, I actually joined a lab in undergrad as well that was run by Dr. Emily Butler at University of Arizona. And she studies emotion regulation in the context of relationships. So it was kind of this really nice, I was seeing these things happening, in the real world. And I was also getting to learn from somebody who, studied these things her whole career. And so it just merged really nicely to, I guess, inform the way that I've been studying these things in graduate school. And I just can say over the last 11 years that I have been diving into this, I really do feel like emotions are at the core of our relationships and relationships are at the core of, our well-being and overall health. So that's, what brought me here.
11 years immersed in this. That's, they always say, it takes a certain amount of hours to become an expert. And I would say by now you've far past that. And so why do you think it's important to apply a social lens when people are learning about emotions?
Yeah, I think there's this tendency that when we think about emotions, we think of them as something that's very private, right? Like we think I am having the emotional experience and I need to deal with this experience. And while that's all true, there's this whole context that we're often experiencing the emotion in, right? And oftentimes that is a social context with, our friends, our romantic partners, even strangers. And so I think by just focusing on the individual, you lose so much of the nuance that's really there in our everyday interactions. And so I try to apply a social lens to understand, for example, not just how I might manage my emotions, but how might someone else in the situation help me manage my emotions? Or how are they affected by my emotions? Because it's a very interpersonal two-way process oftentimes. I say two-way because I tend to study only two people at a time. But to be fair, this can be a group process as well if there are, more than two people in the situation, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in clinic this weekend and I was with a person who had been because you start to see some family dynamics for people when they're talking about their health, and how they were parented or how they were, because, emotional expression in Ayurveda, we study its effect on the body. And when you have a certain emotion, what humorally it's doing to a body, which I want to geek out on some of the ways that you're measuring that in your studies, which is super fascinating. But, it's like the ways that we interact with people can affect, or how we can, you'll say this so much better than me, but the safety that we feel in a situation, the freedom that we feel in a situation can dictate how freely we allow things to flow. And I'm sure you've really dove into this so much through the years. One of the papers that you were the lead researcher on is called Individual Differences in Social Power, Links with Beliefs about Emotion and Emotion Regulation. And you and your colleagues proposed that social power has a lot to do with one's experience of their emotions and how other people will experience them as well, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's actually not a ton of work in this area. And so it was really fun to delve into the literature and try to piece together what might be happening. But yeah, social power is a very interesting construct. In our work, we were proposing that social power might influence the way that we think about emotions. So for example, if I am higher in social power, I may not think that I have to control my emotions, right? I may not think that, and this kind of goes to the idea that I might not face repercussions for letting my emotions fly, right? So you might take, for an example, a boss who is angry and they decide to just let that anger out because, they can't really face repercussions from their subordinates. And so that was kind of the line of thinking, whereas in the subordinates case, it might be a little bit trickier because they're managing, right, this hierarchy, and they might not be able to be their full authentic self and, let those emotions fly because they could face repercussions. So that was kind of where we were thinking in that space.
Wow. So that really brings up a lot. I think this idea of letting your emotions fly and how that's like, I actually had never really thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense that if you feel like there are fewer repercussions to you being able to do that, then you'd be more likely to do that. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And it also makes a lot of sense for why, people in the media and like celebrities and stuff do so much weird stuff.
Right. No, exactly. I do think there are so many things that are tied to this as well, right? Like this can even get into, I think, like culture or identity and how, comfortable we feel actually, being expressive and really letting ourselves be out there and vulnerable with who we're around. Because in some cases, it could backfire. So it's definitely something I think that when you're thinking of social norms, I think it is something that's on people's minds when they're in social contexts, for sure.
So do we want to regulate our emotions or not?
It's a great question. After I ask myself the same thing after kind of, reading all the literature. And to be honest, sometimes it can get a little messy. Sometimes, one study is telling you one thing and another study is telling you another thing. And it's like, okay, how do we make sense of this? I fall in the camp of thinking that there's a time and place for everything and that context really matters. So for a very, very long time, the emotion regulation literature said that suppression, which involves hiding your emotional behavior. So that means like I might be feeling angry, but I'm not showing anybody that I'm angry. And they said that suppression was always bad. It was just kind of framed as this not great strategy. You should never use it. It's got all these terrible effects. And what's really interesting is more nuanced work lately has really been trying to figure out, is it always bad or is it just bad in certain contexts? Like, are there specific contexts where it could actually maybe serve some useful functions? And there is work showing that suppression can actually be adaptive in certain cases. So there was a study, this was done a bit ago, where winners actually suppressed some of their pride after winning something, and people were actually more positively responsive to the people who suppress their pride, right? Rather than kind of just showboating and, being super proud of yourself, kind of the people that kind of reined it in and were proud, but, at kind of a calmer level, they were actually viewed more positively by others. And so I do think when we're talking about emotion regulation, it's really important to think about context and just remember that it's not always good or bad. Actually, so the same thing happens with reappraisal, which is a common strategy that gets studied, which involves kind of reframing whatever is happening to you to try to kind of change how you're feeling about it. And for a long time in the literature, everyone said reappraisal is always good, right? It was kind of like the flip side to suppression. It was like suppression's bad, reappraisal is good. And there's actually a lot of work out now saying that, again, context matters. In some cases, reappraisal is actually not helpful. For example, when you are dealing with a stressor that's controllable, it actually is more beneficial and adaptive for you to deal with the controllable stressor, right? So if I try to reappraise it to make myself feel better, I might not actually deal with the thing that I can deal with. And that's actually not helpful in the long run. Whereas if something's uncontrollable, it's actually really helpful to use reappraisal because there's really nothing, concrete that can be done about it, but you can help make yourself feel better about it. So those are just some illustrations of how I really think context matters. And we can't really have this, black and white idea of like whether emotion regulation is, useful or not useful.
I think this is super fascinating. Are you familiar with the term spiritual bypassing?
Actually, I've heard of it, but I could use it definition.
So it's a word that comes up in the sort of like wellness and especially like in the yoga world a lot. And people who are into various spiritual practices, maybe, ranging from yoga and meditation to like mindfulness and even Buddhism and stuff like that kind of comes up in those worlds a lot. And this idea that it sounds a little bit like reappraisal. Yeah. So like in the yogic texts, because the yogic texts that we study when we become yoga teachers, it's essentially like one of the books is like this kind of how-to manual for your mind. It's sort of like, if you concentrate on this, this will happen. If you concentrate on this, this will happen. It's kind of fascinating. And, one of them is this practice of like turning a negative into a positive.
Right, right.
Which is, I know the Sanskrit word for it, which is like pratipaksha bhavana. And it sounds a little bit like reappraisal. So it's almost like reframing of a fact or perception.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, that you brought that up because I remember when I first started studying reappraisal, I struggled with that a little bit in terms of thinking about how much people might be like twisting reality, if that makes, to kind of help themselves feel better about something and how useful that is, which is why I think we see some of these, differences pan out, because I think when you can just do something about the emotion that you're feeling, it does make sense to me to try to turn that into a positive. But if there's something about the situation that you could change and you're choosing to reframe that to me seems, like it could potentially go wrong.
Yeah. And it's funny because, I think a lot of people out there right now, a lot of people doing all these like wellness practices, various kinds of personal development. If you're listening, you know who you are. Many of us would consider, ourselves to be, or like even people who are into mindfulness, like they're spending a lot of time trying to control and regulate their emotions. Are you and your colleagues saying that if we just like unleash our emotions, then we'll gain social power?
That's a great question. I do not think that is the way to gain social power necessarily. I do think, there could be something of a bidirectional relationship there, suggesting that, like not regulating, could lead to higher power. But I actually think that potentially the way that you gain power is actually kind of by maybe falling into norms a little bit more, as you're getting up the ladder. And so I think that's why people kind of in lower power and intermediate power, I think, tend to kind of keep things more in lines with social norms. Whereas then when you get to kind of a higher power position, you've kind of, made it, in quote, and then you have more of that power, right, to kind of act in a way that is more authentic to yourself. But yeah, I would just be careful because I do think that social norms, are very real. And so I think it makes sense why in the lower power positions, we see more regulation for sure.
That's so fascinating. So you're thinking about this when you say higher and lower positions, you're thinking about this in terms of like somebody working for a company or somebody having a platform of some sort in the social context, that like the higher the position, the more famous you are, the more, things like that, that those are examples of when people have higher social power.
Yeah. In some places, because the way that we think about power is basically having resources and the ability to kind of like influence others. And so exactly what you described, people in those positions. And it's possible that, what I'm describing is not true across all different contexts, but I think in some particular contexts, when social norms are particularly at play, these pieces could be relevant. And to your point, in our paper, I should specify that we look at social power as rated by the participant. So we're not really seeing, right, like we're not able to tell how others are perceiving them, whether they actually do have this power, outside of their own head, if that makes sense. So that is one limitation of the paper. And I think another reason why I try to study at least two people, in a unit if I can at a time, because I think having that other source of information is really useful for seeing like, is this just in the person's head or, is there some corroborating evidence, right, that this is kind of what's happening?
That's so true. It's so strange how, we can believe things about ourselves that are not realistic on the outside. Yeah, that's really cool that you do that. So did you want to elaborate?
I do think the reports matter from the self, right? Like I'm definitely not trying to say that they do not have validity. I just also think that they're happening, as I was mentioning before, right, in such a rich context that, without gathering some of that context, I think information gets lost. So I wanted to make that point.
I can assure you that there have been times in my life where I thought I was much more important than I really was.
Well, same here. Yeah. The friend reports would probably not match my reports in all cases.
Well, that's good. So is there a difference between, just from a terminology perspective, is there a difference between suppressing an emotion and controlling an emotion, or are they kind of the same thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would argue the way that we think about it, at least in the research world, is that control is a broader term that encompasses kind of any kind of strategy that you're using. But control is also, we've noticed that when we use the word in surveys, people are very reactive to it. So I like to think about changing emotions as kind of like the broad category, right? Like, how do you change your emotions? And then we have all these strategies underneath it, including, suppression and reappraisal. And I do think, control, we kind of try to like leave it out because it's got a little bit of baggage, I feel like, when people see that. But yeah, I do think they're different things for sure.
So this idea that controlling, it doesn't surprise me that people react to controlling an emotion. There's also this idea of like you experience an emotion, right? Like, what about the difference between suppressing and managing? Would you say those are the same or different, like managing an emotion?
Yeah, I still see managing kind of as a broader category. I guess I'm biased, though, to think of suppression, reappraisal, like acceptance, like kind of when you talk about mindfulness, like one strategy that we talk about a lot in the like emotion regulation literature is acceptance, to get at that idea of mindfulness, just accepting whatever is coming up and not judging it. And so those three strategies, and there are other strategies as well, but I see those as kind of like strategies under this core umbrella of, managing or controlling or, changing your emotions. So that's kind of the way that I structure it in my head.
Now that I have a 6-year-old child and get to see his emotions flowing freely, I've really had to think a lot about how I respond to his emotions. And I don't want to be that parent who, when the kid falls, immediately says, "You're okay," and tries to brush it off. Also don't want to be that parent that's like, "Oh no, my poor baby," and kind of overreacts. But it's really difficult to find that middle ground so that the kid's emotions can flow when they come up. And at the same time, the kid can shift into a better state easily and then maybe even learn how not to get so reactive next time this happens.
Completely. I actually have some work that it's not published yet, but I'm working with another graduate student here, Regina Ebo, and we are looking at how parents' beliefs about emotions influence their relationship with their child. And it's really, really intriguing because, I don't think this is, super surprising, but parents who believe that their children should control their emotions report worse outcomes with their children, right? Because oftentimes, I feel like you were just hinting at, children have big emotions. They don't quite know what to do with them, right? They're looking for kind of some structure on how to manage them. And so, parents who are kind of going in with this really strong belief that they should be able to, it's unfortunately not going so well.
One of the papers that you were the lead researcher on is called Spontaneous Suppression in Dating Couples, Social and Physiological Correlates of Suppressing Negative and Positive Emotions During Negative and Positive Conversations. And I'd love for you to talk about this research because I think we can learn a lot about ourselves, about why we choose to let flow what flows out of us and why we censor certain things within ourselves. But first, how do you measure negative versus positive emotions?
Yeah. So I will say there are debates in the emotion literature about how to go about this. But in our lab, what we tend to do is ask participants a set of, maybe like 20 different specific emotions. So for example, I've been talking about like anger, sadness as, some examples of negative emotions that we would ask about. And then for positive emotions, we might ask about gratitude, happiness. And what we do is basically create an average across all of those items to kind of get one score of how, negatively they experience the conversation and how positively they experience the conversation. There's pros and cons to that. Again, just to say people have very strong opinions on, whether you should look at the specific emotions themselves, because there is a lot of information in there. For example, gratitude does wonders for relationships, right? So you could do a whole paper just on gratitude. But in our lab, we were really curious about just kind of looking at that overall positivity and negativity.
So are there specific emotions that are always considered negative and others that are always considered positive? For example, like, is an emotion such as anger always considered negative, while an emotion like happiness is always considered positive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say there is some gray area in terms of emotions that can, so for example, compassion or sympathy is one that is often considered actually a positive emotion. But it's interesting because the person who's experiencing it actually doesn't feel that great. Like, right? Like you can imagine feeling sympathetic, like you kind of feel, I'm kind of using another emotion, but there's, some sadness in there mixed in with, prosociality and other people, wanting to help. And so even though it leads to kind of good, positive things, it kind of feels bad. And so that categorization gets a little blurry. And then another one that comes to mind is awe. Awe is a really intriguing emotion that's gotten a lot of traction in the last few years. And some people can experience awe in this really positive way where you just feel, like there's so much out in the world and you feel so small. And it's just this really, amazing grounding experience. Whereas some people can actually experience it in a way that's kind of fearful. Like you're seeing yourself as so small and the world seems so big. And so it can be hard to classify sometimes because people have different experiences with the same emotion.
That makes a lot of sense to me because from the Ayurvedic perspective, we would associate awe with the space element. It's big, it's wide, it's possibly even empty, and the space element, when you raise the space element, you raise vata, which is the energy of movement. And so when suddenly someone's space element is increased and they get zooted out into a field of awareness that is larger than what they are used to, when this energy of air and space increases, then these individuals that have pre-existing high levels of air and space elements already within their inner space are going to feel overwhelmed. Whereas someone who has perhaps decreased space element or increased water in the body, that they might actually feel a sense of relief in that sense of awe or that sense of increased space. And the bigness of it all for those people in the latter situation is actually calming. But in the first example I gave, those people who already have high levels of vata, high levels of air and space, because there is too much in their life already, too much in their body already, then they may feel like it's just too much. And I was actually surprised when I was studying Ayurveda to learn that one of the categories of imbalances, and these are imbalances of the physiological, emotional, mental, spiritual bodies that we have in Ayurveda, that some health conditions are actually caused by increased joy. And I thought, how unfair is that? Because I thought we were supposed to find unlimited joy. But no, apparently you can have too much of it and you might become manic if you have too much joy. So we want these energies, not too much, not too little. We want them in just the right amounts for our particular system.
How interesting. Yeah, I had never really thought beyond, we think about positive and negative emotions a lot, and I do actually do some work. We've talked a little bit about this in email, but I do a little bit of work on valuing happiness and how kind of overvaluing happiness can be associated with actually worse outcomes. And what you said just kind of made me think a little bit about how things that can be good, right, at certain levels can also be bad kind of in any extreme, right? So like zero joy, probably not great. And this like really extreme joy also, might be not as adaptive as kind of this middle ground. And I would argue, though, that might be true for most emotions, honestly, right? This, I think, really, really intense experiences of emotions could potentially, right, indicate that maybe something is off. And that's not to say that, if you're just having a good time, right, like that's totally fine. But I'm just saying, I do think there's something to say for balance, right? And kind of the extremes on either side might be an indication that something is a little off.
Okay, so on the topic of suppressing emotions, so do people suppress positive emotions too? I thought it was just the negative ones, or maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I think if you're kind of dampening your response, right, like kind of using suppression so you're not like letting the full expression out, right, that's matching your experience, I definitely think that's a form of suppression. And I think this is a really interesting case, like the example that you just gave and the one that, we had discussed earlier. This is where I think the individual viewpoint and the social viewpoint can matter a lot, because for the individual, like myself, it might feel really good for me to just be able to express all that pride. So like if I'm just thinking within my head, that could be good. But if I'm thinking about the social consequences and how I might be perceived and then how down the line that might influence my connections, right, I might want to dampen a little bit to, show that humility so that those aren't influenced negatively, if that makes sense. So that's where I just find this idea of what's happening in me versus kind of like how it interacts with and influences my social environment very interesting. So in the paper that you were referencing, we do find that using spontaneous suppression is associated with worse outcomes for myself, but we don't actually see it for the partner. And I think that's a really interesting just divergence, right? That we're seeing that there can be consequences that are like in you and you're separate from your social context, if that makes sense.
Wait, are you saying that it's bad for me if I suppress my emotions and that it's good for the other person if I suppress my emotions?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily good for the other person, but we weren't seeing any costs associated with it. And so that's kind of showing that it's like benign, right? So, which it's given suppression's history as just being this awful strategy, we thought that was really interesting because it seems like there's a reason people use this strategy, right? And I think that's something that I've actually talked with James Gross about this. He is the person that made the measures that we use to do this. And he's like, why do people keep doing it, right? There has to be a reason. And so we think that it really does come down to kind of social norms, social appropriateness, and kind of like I was saying, timing, right? Like you might be in a conversation with your partner and you have something that you really want to say and you want to get it off your chest, but, maybe just the timing is not quite right. And so you wait to say it or deliver it, until the next day or something. Like, it's an example of kind of like using suppression, like not giving, not expressing that emotion that you're feeling to your partner. You might be doing that to kind of like save the relationship, at least in that moment. And so there's this really tricky balance then, right? Of, well, that can still go wrong, right? Like if I'm using suppression kind of all the time to save the peace, then, you're never getting heard. And so it's really such a delicate balance because I think there are times and places where suppression can be useful and helpful. And I think that if you do it all the time, that's also not going to help you, right? Because you do want to be able to bring your authentic self into some parts of your relationship at least, right? If not all of them. And so that's where this balance, which I don't think researchers can really pin down at the moment because it's just so complex to be able to say, how flexibly do you need to be able to use these strategies to have, a really adaptive emotion regulation strategy, usage.
Because we really need to feel safe to be able to express ourselves, don't we?
Exactly. And on the flip side to that, right, if we walk around never getting to express ourselves, there are costs, that would be really costly to us, right? Like potentially mental health issues, depression, things like that. So it really is, it's the balance, I think.
Felicia, in your research, one of the themes I'm picking up on is about people being authentic versus inauthentic in social contexts. Why does authenticity matter from an emotional standpoint?
Yeah. So authenticity is related to well-being, right? Because authenticity is basically just about being able to be true to yourself. And so you can imagine that people who are able to be true to themselves just, feel better. They're able to show up to spaces as themselves. They don't feel like they kind of have to put masks on, for example. And so the way that I see this relating to emotions is that if, for example, you're using, suppression, you're kind of hiding a part of yourself, right? And again, maybe it might be protective in some context, but if you do that over time, then you have the potential, to feel inauthentic, and that can hurt your overall well-being down the line.
I don't know why this is coming to mind, but I just can't help but think about what's happening with all these teenagers who flip out and shoot up their schools. I hate even talking about this, but I would imagine that a fair amount of emotional firepower being stored inside a person who hasn't expressed his or her emotions, those hot emotions like anger, this emotional processing piece is so much more important than people realize, isn't it?
That I definitely, cannot speak to as an expert, but I will say that it makes complete sense to me that as a child, especially in adolescence, when there are so many, I think, social norms that we kind of forget about as adults. Like I know we're aware of them as adults, of course, because we're dealing with our own, but in adolescence, there's so many norms, you really want to fall in line with the norms usually because there are such consequences for not falling within the norms. And I do think that, not being able to be your authentic self can definitely have consequences that, could range from smaller type consequences to what you were describing, catastrophic.
We're going to feel safer in certain environments more than others. And that really has a large impact on how freely we feel that we can be ourselves, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And I think with authenticity in particular, to feel like you can come as your authentic self in a space, there needs to be a certain level of trust, and you want to feel like you will be understood. And I think that for most people, that's not everywhere we go, like that there are specific contexts where we do feel that safe to bring our full authentic selves.
So my understanding is that in the lab, you study a couple of different things to determine the emotional state that a person may be experiencing. We were emailing about this a couple of weeks ago because I'm so interested in learning how you can actually tell what's going on inside a person in a study like this.
Yeah. So we kind of refer to them as, the reason I say kind of, there are so many different ways to talk about it, but we call them emotion response systems. And so there are 3 different kinds that we focus on. There's the experience, which is what I say I'm feeling. So it's just how I'm like labeling it and experiencing it. And then there's the behavior. So that's what I'm showing on the outside to people, or, just showing on the outside in general. I guess people don't have to be present. And then the third is the physiology. So that's what's actually happening inside my body that, I don't have control over. It's the physiology. Those 3 systems are what we focus on when we're thinking about an emotional episode. And there's a lot to this as well, because not everybody agrees that those 3 systems make up an emotion. But again, in our lab, that's how we think about an emotion.
Are there ways to measure every single emotion in the lab through, say, like a combination of surveying people about their inner experience, maybe mixed with the outer measurements that can be done?
Yeah, so the measures we've been using are actually a bit different. So for the work that we're doing right now, we're actually trying to see how much those systems relate to one another, if at all. And so in order to do that, you need some pretty complex data. And so rather than using surveys, what we do is we have participants actually use a rating dial. So it's literally a continuous dial where, we ask them, okay, while you're doing this task, we'd like you to move this dial to indicate how much positivity or negativity you're feeling during the entire task. And Iris, who you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, has work showing that doesn't actually influence the emotional process. So we feel confident that that is a good indicator of their experience. And so we get second by second data on how they're feeling across a specific task that's probably, it ranges from 3 minutes to 5 minutes, for example. And then we get the same second by second data for their physio because, we have them hooked up to all the physio equipment and it's continuously recording. And then we actually have trained research assistants watch the videos of participants in these tasks, and they use the exact same rating dial to indicate how much positivity or negativity the participants are expressing. And so it's really, I'm kind of geeking out because I think it's really cool data because we get these beautiful kind of time or lines that show what we call time series. And so we get to see how the experience, the behavior, and the physiology change over time during a task. And it's honestly really cool to see the systems, graph together and how some are kind of in sync and others are not. And yeah, that's what we've been looking at recently.
Okay. So can you give me an example of how you might measure one specific emotion, like anger, for example?
Yeah. So, anger is just one that I feel like is relatively useful to study because it's usually an intense emotion that we see some physiological profiles, happening. And so for anger, if someone is saying they experience anger, we expect to see, like, I'm thinking of behavior as well. We expect to see like a furrowed brow, for example, maybe a clenched jaw. And then when we're looking at their physiological patterns, we expect to see something like a fast increased heart rate, right? And then also increased blood pressure. And the reason that we expect these physiological patterns is because anger is typically preparing someone for a response, right? It's usually like, for example, you can think when you're angry, you kind of are in this position where you feel like you want to do something. And so that's why we tend to see kind of more activation in the sympathetic nervous system.
Can you measure sadness on a physiological level too?
Yes, you can. It's a little bit trickier, sadness, because it's less physiologically arousing. But Iris does have some work that shows that sadness is associated with lower skin conductance level. So that was just one kind of indicator that we were looking at when we think about sadness. But it is a little bit harder because it's less physiologically arousing, right? So it's a little bit, I would say, easier, for lack of a better word, to study emotions where you get this kind of big response, including like amusement, for example, is another one that can be helpful, or that is kind of easier to study.
Yeah, I guess because of all the ways that we've all had different kinds of conditioning and upbringings and our life experiences, that there could be kind of many different ways that we all experience even the same type of emotion.
Right. Right. I know. Yeah, that would be really helpful. I will say it's a bit easier to see. We call it coherence when I'm talking about this kind of alignment between different response systems. We refer to it as emotion coherence. And we do see more kind of clear evidence for experience behavior coherence. So meaning, when I say I'm angry and I'm showing angry facial expressions, for example, or postural, expressions, we tend to see that more evidence for that in the literature than the experience physiology coherence. And I think that's because it's just tricky to kind of map on a one-to-one to so many different emotions that we experience, because they're really varied and people differ in how they experience them, even in their bodies. So it's a bit trickier with physio, I think, for sure.
And now we're ready for the final question of the day, which is, what does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
I actually thought of this when I saw the name of your podcast, because I had told you originally, I was like, I don't feel like I'm an expert in anything that your audience might care about. The more I thought about it, I was like, thanks to your encouragement, I was like, actually, a lot of things I do, even if I'm not specifically focused on physiology, like emotions are part of us, right? And so like, even though it might not be that I'm, thinking about physiology, I think just being in tune with your emotions to me feels kind of like listening to the wisdom of your body. So that was kind of how I had reappraised or reframed it, but that was kind of how I was thinking. I was making a connection with my work in the wisdom of the body. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your learnings from your research today. And what I'd love to know is if people would like to get in touch with you to learn more about your work, what is the best way for them to do that? I can paste the link to the info about the lab you're in.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'd love for people to reach out because I feel like there's so much work on this. So it'd be helpful to kind of know maybe a little more about what they're specifically interested in. And then I can guide them toward maybe some researchers or work, that have covered the topics that they're specifically interested in.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. I want to thank you for listening to this show. It brings me great pleasure to provide this content to you. I also want to let you know that I'll be making some very amazing announcements soon. And if you're not already on my email list, then I encourage you to go over to my website and subscribe to my email list so that I can keep you informed about these announcements that are going to be coming up very soon. So my website is heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And I look forward to getting these important announcements to you very soon and connecting. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.